Hi everybody and welcome to another edition of the We Are Mission podcast. I am delighted to be joined by the Director of the Scottish Catholic Education Service today, Barbara Coupar. Barbara, thanks very much for joining us.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So Barbara, just tell, for people who maybe don't know who you are, tell us a wee bit about your background, the school you went up to, your parishes, your upbringing, your hobbies, interests, things like that.
Okay, that'll be long. I've had a long life. So I was born and raised in Cumbernauld. I went to St Helens Primary School, St Maurice's Secondary School. Majority of my teenage life was in Our Lady in St Helens Parish in Condorrat. When I was 19, I moved to Denison, which is where we are at the moment, where the SCES offices are. I went to university to study a Bachelor of Divinity at the University of Glasgow and was in Our Lady of Good Counsel parish. And from that, I moved into my professional career, which was to become a teacher. In terms of hobbies and interests, there's nothing exciting to tell you. I used to do a bit of amateur dramatics, loved a bit of hill walking. Probably one of the highlights of my life has been reaching the top of Kilimanjaro on behalf of St Andrew's Hospice to raise money for them. But yeah, quiet wee life.
And when you were at school in your younger years, what did you want to be?
I wanted to be a journalist, actually. I wanted to be a journalist focusing on religious education. So when I was in 5th and 6th year, I went to the careers officers and I said, I'd like to study theology. And they said, there's actually no way to do that at the moment because there was a Bible college in Glasgow. There was the faculties of divinity in the kind of big universities. But there actually wasn't really a route for a Catholic female to go and study theology. And it's an interesting one because there's probably not actually a Catholic route at the moment in Scotland for women to go and study theology. So I left school and I went to Glasgow Caledonian University and I started a BSc in Computer Information Science and I absolutely hated it. And within about 6 months, I was going to my mum and saying, can I leave uni? And her words of wisdom were, yes, you can, but not until you've got a job. And the reason I didn't like it was because every module we did, now we're talking back in the very, very early 1990s, when there was a revolution going on with computer information science. And it felt to me as if every module we did, they were saying, once you complete this module, you'll be able to command this amount of salary, you'll be able to do this, you'll be able to do that. So anyway, I left university and I went to live in Italy for 6 months with the Focolare movement and their permanent Mariapolis in Lopiano in Tuscany, and kind of readjusted where my head was at, came back and I applied for a Bachelor of Divinity at the University of Glasgow and was fortunate enough to get in. And at the end of my degree, I went to the BBC and said, can I have a job, please, in your RE department? That was when they used to have an RE department. And I started to do a bit of work in trying to see what research would be like, what journalism would be like, etc. But in the back of my head, there was something that was like, no, that's not what you're meant to be. And I found my path to teaching. It wasn't like a big Damascus moment. It was right, let's give it a try. And that's where I found that I was at home in teaching.
Excellent. And I think I know the answer to this question, but did you come from quite a traditional Catholic family? Did faith play quite an important role? And if somebody goes on to study divinity, you'd imagine that it did.
Yeah. So my parents were, I would say, quietly Catholic. We were very, very fortunate that we moved to Cumbernauld when it was growing as a new town. We were the first people in our house in Condorrat. We didn't even have a parish in Condorrat at the time. The church wasn't there. So we were kind of original residents, if you like, original parishioners. The priest's house was actually across the back from us, and that's where we used to go to mass. We participated in now we weren't unique in this. This was our community in Condorrat, where there were the family rosary. Every single family took a week of the year, and traditional Catholic is probably the best word for it. We'd go to Baclivey, to the kind of open days. We'd do the Margaret Sinclair Mass, those kind of things. But I think the reason why my parents were so keen for us to maintain our tradition was we lived in Saudi Arabia for a number of years. My dad worked in the Middle East pretty much my whole life, and they were very aware of what we didn't have when we were there. So we were there in the 1970s. We had a parish priest at that point, but it wasn't as straightforward as being at home. And so I think my parents were instilling in the four of us the fact that if you're rooted in something, that'll anchor you for your whole life. And I think that's been the case.
So tell us a wee bit more about that. What was it like being a Catholic in Saudi Arabia?
Do you know, it was only when I started being asked to go into high schools, in particular to go and do kind of award ceremonies, that I reflected on what that was like. Because when you're a child, you just live it, don't you? You don't really think anything of it. So I was in primary one, and we went out, and there was a big Filipino kind of family, if you like, who worked alongside my dad. And I now see that part of what my father taught us was this idea of the Catholic family, that there's no hierarchy within that. He was a white manager, and they were expected to act in a particular way. But of a Friday, that's when we would have celebrated Mass there, because that would have been the holy day in Saudi Arabia. We would go along to our parish, and we would be the only kind of white people. Everybody else had been there from pretty much the Philippines or the Asian continent, and we celebrated with them. And it was joyous. It was absolutely joyous. My big sister made her first Holy Communion out there, which now is pretty much unheard of. So we used to go. I have a false memory of we actually went to a church, but my siblings tell me it was just like a big gym hall that we went to, and we had Mass every single week. And my mum and dad kept up the traditions of things like May devotions and etc. within the house. What's been interesting for me is seeing the change there, because as I say, my dad worked in the Middle East my whole life. When I was 21, I went back to Jeddah for a holiday with him and my mum. And at that point, the priest was now in Saudi on a visa as an engineer. You couldn't go to Mass unless you knew the secret password to get in somewhere in order to be able to do it. Everything had changed in those 20 or 30 years. So that's been really interesting. But as a wee girl, it was just how things were, and we just, at the weekend, we circulated with a different kind of people than we did on a Monday to Thursday in school.
So you had a kind of very good example of the Universal Church there as well.
And do you know, now even the world is so small, isn't it? And it's getting smaller with technology and with travel. And I think when you think about what the Holy Father says about Laudato Si, and about that idea about it's not just an environmental conversion, it's about that ecological conversion of loving God, loving your neighbour. And from being a wee girl, I didn't see people of other races as being people who needed, that old adage, a hand up, but they were my friends,
In terms of getting in a wee bit deeper, things like saints and scripture passages, are there any that really kind of define and inspire your faith?
So I was a bit of a rebel when I was a child, and in primary 7, when we were being confirmed, when everybody was, you were researching your saint and choosing one, and you can imagine that Bernadette was a big choice for a lot of the girls in my class. I chose Peter, and my confirmation name is Peter. And I remember being asked why, and I said, and this actually does make me a wee bit emotional, because it's one of those ones you try to kind of like reconnect with the reason why you said it in the first place. So the reason I picked Peter is because he was, in my mind, Jesus's best friend, and I thought, I want to be Jesus's best friend, and I thought, well, that's who I want to model my life on. If I were to pick a saint, that's who it would be. And recently, the scripture passage, "Put your net there," from the resurrection kind of narratives, has been one that has been very helpful for me in my personal, spiritual, and professional life. That idea of you're doing your best, and you're doing the job, if you want, that you think you're good at. Peter was out there fishing, and he had no luck whatsoever. When Christ says, "Put your net there," that's when you will succeed. And that's probably the scripture passage that I try to kind of keep in my mind.
Magic. Just in terms of going back to your kind of the start of your career in education, what was the kind of catalyst for you deciding to become an educator, and was anyone a real major influence in that decision?
So I think there was no. I was talking recently at a conference, and I was saying I'm always in awe of these people who have Damascus moments, and they have these big moments of epiphany in their life, where they've gone down the wrong road, or whatever. I've never had any of that. I've had a fabulous life, and I've always tried to say yes to everything. This is again something I see when I go into schools. I was the original FOMO girl, I would be like, I was in the Scouts, I was in the Guides, I was in the youth theatre, I would go to every party going on, as well as all the church things, right? I was normal in that sense. But I would always be like, oh, well, why wouldn't I do that? Why wouldn't I go in that course? Why wouldn't I? So I don't know if there was ever like a defining moment that said, teaching is for you. I think I did it because I knew I wanted to study religion. I knew I wanted to know more about religion, but at that point, I didn't know what career I would go into. But when I went into teaching and went on my first teaching practice, I knew that I was comfortable doing it. And I think that sometimes that's the only way you can know you're doing the right thing, isn't it? When you're at peace and it works out. And if it doesn't work out, go and do something else,
Just and it's one of the things that I always talk to the kids about when I get into schools. I talk to them about teachers that have had a major impact in my life. I can think of my primary 3 and primary 5 teachers in particular, and then some at secondary school. So, what were there teachers that were kind of really positive influences in your life?
I don't think there was one in particular teacher. I think that there was a kind of culture, certainly within our primary school, of all the teachers being a positive influence and positive faith witness. I'd actually say it was more the school chaplain when I was at secondary school who was a big influence on us. It was Father Donnelly, Father Willie Donnelly, who was our parish priest actually, and was the chaplain of St Maurice's. And I think it was the idea of being known by somebody. So that way where you're kind of, you're in a school of thousands of people, and, people walking down the corridor, and somebody knows you by name and invites you to do something. And I remember that now. It could well be, just it so happened we were in his parish, and it was kind of like, right, get yourself to Friday Mass kind of thing. But I'd say that he was more of an influence than a particular teacher.
Okay. And in terms of your career trajectory in the world of education, it's quite decorated. It's quite involved. So tell us a wee bit about that.
Okay, so I started as a religious education teacher and a supply teacher. Like, that's the story of most people, isn't it? So back in the day, there was no, you didn't come out of college and go into an NQT or newly qualified teacher year. You didn't get that job the first year. So what a lot of us had to do was you just kind of registered on supply roles, and you know that's sometimes the making of people, because you're actually having to go into lots of different schools, maybe for 1 day, 2 days, etc., and you're having to establish yourself, you're having to be organised, you know, all these kind of things. So baptism of fire when I started, but very quickly I had a kind of longer role in Lourdes in Glasgow, from September to the end of October. And then again, just the way things happened, I got a phone call saying that Notre Dame High School in Greenock needed a supply teacher. The principal teacher there had moved on to another role, and in fact, the other teacher, she had Jane, an amazing lady, she'd fallen, and I think she'd broken her arm. So 2 of us from my class went into Notre Dame, and we had a great time. We were just out of college. We were able to kind of bounce ideas off each other. And when that job came up permanently, I was very fortunate to get it. And within 2 years, I became the principal teacher of RE. And again, that's not necessarily through my talent. It was being in the right place at the right time. I'm not a particularly ambitious person, but I do feel very seriously about discerning what the right thing is to do, and so saying yes if it's the right thing to do. So I became the principal teacher, and I loved that job. I loved that school. I still hanker for the community, the culture, the identity. It was a fabulous time to be a teacher. And then I was, the SCES didn't exist at that point. So SCES was established by Michael McGrath, and he put in a power of work of establishing SCES as the voice for Catholic education in Scotland. And he began to work on building national resources, and I was invited to help co-create some materials, which are called Call to Love. They're what we use for relationships education in secondary schools. So that was my first kind of dabble into the world of kind of national education, and it was enjoyable, and I liked having that kind of aspect of my role. And a couple of years later, a job came up in SCES as a religious education advisor, and I'm smirking because I'm not sure whether to say this on the record. I always laugh that what happened was there's two legends of Catholic education who were the RE advisors for Motherwell Diocese and for the Archdiocese of Glasgow, and they were retiring. Or Bill Horton and Willie Liston, they're absolute legends. They were moving on to other things. They were full time in each of the dioceses, and I always laugh and say that they took these 2 full-time jobs, they put them together, they added SCES, and they gave it to a woman. So, and that's how I ended up working for the church.
Yeah. Just in terms of your early days, like as a teacher, what was your kind of first impressions? What was it like? What were some of the things that you really took to, and what were some of the challenges?
So, I think we've got this idea of a kind of rose-tinted view of the past, sometimes within the church, that everything was so much better in the 60s or 70s, where families were all traipsing along to mass, or, you know, there was, and when I started teaching, I realised it's probably never been thus. You know, there's families have always had their complexities and their challenges, and I would say that the biggest joy of being a teacher is building relationships with the young people that you're and being an RE teacher is such a privilege. You don't have the same pressures, I would say, as some of the other teachers who are working towards national exams. Now, certainly within the department I was in, the young people didn't get put forward for higher RMPS or anything like that to begin with anyway. So the religious education classroom is like a little ecosystem of the real world. It's a comprehensive classroom. You're not streamed. It's not the top and bottom classes. It's just real life, and the debates and the conversations and the I don't believe in gods and the all those kind of things, they were equally challenging as they were joy filled, I would say.
In terms of your time in the classroom, was there any kind of standout stories or memories or things like that?
I think for me the kind of things that stand out the most are the opportunities where we had to pray together. So we had a yearly cycle for every young person to have the chance to go on a version of a retreat. And so I think kind of getting out of that idea of religious education just happens in 2 periods in the classroom. So the standout moments for me would be the times where we would have adoration in the auditory, and you would have the person who would never sit still or was always a pain in the neck, but then you could just see that something had changed within them. Or when you gave them the opportunity, young people the opportunity for service. I used to go to Lourdes with the Diocese of Paisley every summer, and that I would say is one of the recurring things that comes back to me is that young people, when you give them the opportunity to put their faith into action through service, they just excel. So those kind of things, rather than, as I say, a kind of a big moment of anything that happened in the class.
And you've talked to me a bit about how you got involved with SCES. Tell us how you came to be the director.
I wasn't going to apply for the job. I have to say, it was probably one of those moments of what if you don't apply and someone takes on the role that doesn't have the same vision for SCES. What would that be like? So I think ultimately the reason I applied was because Michael McGrath was such a fantastic influence on me. His leadership, his faith witness, his utter determination to ensure that we had a unified voice for Catholic education. He's just such a good role model, and people use that phrase all over the place now, but Michael was such a good role model, and he was so encouraging to me to build up my skills. And I thought, you know what, I'll give it a go. What's the worst that can happen? I'm not out of a job if I don't get it. And then, of course, you go through the same scrutiny and interviews and all those kind of things. And I was absolutely delighted when I was offered the post.
Just going back to that, talking about the foundation of SCES and Michael feeling it important to give the Catholic schools and things like that a voice. Is that something that you would consider important as well, given that a lot of the kind of discourse around about Catholic schools, certainly within the mainstream media, tends to be, why should they exist? And has SCES provided that opportunity to show why they exist and why they're important?
Yeah, I think we've kind of silenced a lot of that narrative. And again, I think that's a lot to do with the establishment of SCES and the being able to stop apologising for us existing in the first place. 2018, when we had the centenary year, when we marked the centenary of the Education Act, was quite an important point in our history to be able to say we're proud to be here, but more importantly, we're good for Scotland. And I think changing it from the story out there from being thank you so much for letting us exist to, do you know what? There are so many families actively choose Catholic education, and those young people go on to serve the common good in Scotland. So what's not good about us, kind of thing, has just been something which has really given confidence to our schools as well, And I think I hope we've got over the misinformed people who say, link things like sectarianism and aspects of I mean, that we should have neutral education. We all know there's no such thing as neutral education. What they mean is to remove God from the public place. And I think that we give ourselves good account in terms of the fact that we are good schools, we're good academically, we form our young people well, and we do all of that through the lens of a Catholic faith.
Just touching upon that's quite an important point in terms of, God in the educational sphere. And you'll tend to find that in Catholic schools that there might be a lot of kids who come from a Muslim background, for example. Has that presented a wee bit of a challenge? Because obviously you're promoting a very Catholic ethos, but people who are Muslim and stuff like that, they've got a very distinct idea about their own faith and things like that. So how do you manage to, in a kind of school setting, you're teaching RE and things like that, you've got the Catholic ethos, how does that marry together?
So I think we're in that very, very fortunate position where so many people do choose Catholic schools, actively choose Catholic schools. As I say, you know yourself that every household in Scotland pretty much is aligned to two schools, a denominational and non-denominational. I was reading the other day that the census, I think there's about 13% of people in the last census identified as Roman Catholic. We're 20% of the school population in Scotland. So we're punching above our weight in terms of the numbers. I think that we are very sensitive to the fact that we're Catholic schools, we're not schools for Catholics. And you mentioned the universal church earlier. That's a story across the world. There are countries in the world where there's no Catholics in Catholic schools because they're, a Muslim nation or they're a Sikh nation or whatever. But the mission of the church still exists, and it's the Catholic Church is the biggest educator in the world. 220,000 schools across the globe, the biggest non-governmental educator in the world, and it's testament to the fact that we understand it as education as a vocation and as part of the mission. Keeping your Catholic identity is absolutely possible with people of other faiths and none. And I think that one of the things can be that we sometimes have to go back, and I think the Synod is really helpful in this. We have to sometimes go back to even looking at what the early apostles went through, when they were, meeting for the first time in Jerusalem and saying, how do we include other people who want to come along to what we are doing? And I think there's probably a balance to be struck between ensuring that everybody feels included, but not losing your own identity.
In terms of, going back to SCES, what would you say are some of the kind of biggest achievements, most memorable things that have kind of happened at your time at SCES? Does anything stand out in particular?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a couple of things. Last Monday, we marked the 10th ceremony of the Caritas Awards, the Pope Benedict XVI Caritas Awards. I think the introduction of the Caritas Award as a legacy to Pope Benedict's visit to Scotland is one of the biggest achievements of SCES. That's 15,000 young people now received the award. Even through COVID, when we couldn't celebrate together as a kind of formal ceremony, we found ways for those young people still to learn about God, to pray together, and to offer acts of witness. So I think that's something. I was just in Australia a couple of weeks ago, sharing the story of Scotland with some Australian educators, Catholic educators, and talking about Caritas. It's such a simple model of accompanying young people in their faith journey and helping them to go out into the world as faith witnesses. But when it's done right, it can have a huge impact. And then the other thing, which I think it has been quite important, I mentioned earlier, was the centenary year. I was just chatting to one of the other church agencies about the Jubilee year for 2025, and I was noting that having commissioned the writing of the icon of Jesus our teacher is one of the things that I'm particularly proud of, that when you walk into our schools now, we've got our history in that icon in practically every school in Scotland.
And Just to give people a wee idea who might not know about the Caritas Award, how does that work?
So the Caritas Award is open. It's an invitation to any young person in their final year of secondary school. Schools tend to do it for sixth year leavers, but it's open to, so if you were a fourth year leaver, you could equally do it. It is looking at the Pope Benedict XVI encyclical Deus Caritas Est as its central kind of point. God is love. And it's exploring what do we mean by God is love through scripture, through church teaching, personal reflection, and then from that personal reflection and prayer, being prompted to act upon it and to take that love out into the world. So young people are, in the first instance, with their teacher. There is some learning, I suppose, is the best way to sum it up, where they would come together, they would pray, they would reflect. They've got a personal journal which accompanies them across the year. And then they begin to think, well, if I believe that God is love, how am I going to show that out in the world? And they are asked to commit to 20 hours of faith witness activity in their school and 20 hours of faith witness activity in their parish or their community. And the fruits of that are just amazing. And it's at the end of the year when we get the opportunity to read the testimonies of the young people, it can be quite transformational. The stories of some young people saying, I'm going to sign up to Caritas because it's in their head, it's like a Catholic Duke of Edinburgh, and it's going to be good for their UCAS form. And they think, oh, I'm going to go and help these old people, or I'm going to go and work in a food bank or whatever, and I'm going to give so much. And actually, their experience is they receive so much. It's the hundredfold, that we hear about in the gospel, that they go in thinking one thing, and the Holy Spirit has a completely different idea.
Yeah, and it's definitely a very popular and well-supported initiative, just based on being there the other week. You've worked with different archbishops during the time at SCES. What kind of helpful things have you learned from them?
Oh my goodness. I think not just archbishops, I would say. All members of the church, I think, have helped me to understand that while we have our structure, and I suppose the way we sum it up isn't it hierarchy, but the most influential people have been the ones who flipped that hierarchy and said that, I might to the world have the most important role, or being called the leader of the Catholic Church, even though we don't have that in Scotland. The ones who've shown me what it means to be humble and to serve have probably had the biggest influence on me in terms of how I undertake my role. I think that our Bishops' Conference have got such a privileged position, but let's face it, a challenging position in today's society, don't they? So to be those, public-facing people who are bringing God's word to other people, and to allow us as laity, to not even allow, to encourage us as laity to take up our position to do the same, has been something which has been a great learning experience for me.
Excellent. Just in terms of the kind of most important qualities or characteristics of someone who wants to be a teacher or work in the field of education, what are they? What are some of the qualities or characteristics they must possess? Because you hear a lot of ridiculous noise and outside, oh, teachers just getting it for the holidays, which is completely and utterly untrue. They go in it because they do have these certain qualities and characteristics and talents. What do you think they are?
So I'm going to just qualify that and say, I think there's something slightly different about Catholic teachers. So I think that all educators need to want to be of service to young people and to the people who they're educating. But I think Catholic teachers are called in a particular way to a vocation. So I think one of the things, first of all, is to have faith yourself. It's that old adage, you cannot give what you do not have. And I think that being formed in your own faith, understanding it, living it is something which is absolutely necessary if you want to accompany young people. But the other things are just simple. Like, you've actually got to be joy-filled. You've got to like young people. You know, I know that sounds like really rudimentary, but I'm always surprised when people are a little bit miserable who kind of want to get into teaching. But what's amazing about learning to be an educator are all the peripheral skills that you learn. You know, have you ever tried to go on a night out with teachers? Like, there's 40 people organising it, you know, they've all got these amazing timekeeping skills and organisational skills and relational skills as well. So I think some of those can be developed even if you don't have them in the first instance. Becoming a teacher, and I say that intentionally, becoming a teacher, because I don't think we start off as the perfect educators. I think that across our careers, we're formed in that, and as you become a teacher, that there are so many characteristics and skills which you probably didn't even know you had in the first place.
And just following on from that, what would be some of the kind of main positives about working in education, being a teacher? And, be brutally honest, what are some of the negatives?
So the positives are, I heard someone use the phrase glory stories recently, are those little moments where they don't even happen at the time. They're maybe 10, 15 years down the line when you bump into a pupil and you see the difference in their lives. And I'm not talking about because of you as an individual, I'm talking about the system. The education system in Scotland is absolutely fabulous. When you think that from a very, very young age, we have got the opportunity for our young people to be educated. So those, I think, are the most rewarding moments, is seeing a young person become who they're meant to be. The challenges, I think, are the things that are imposed on schools. I see so many kind of, I suppose the easiest way to put it are kind of adult hang-ups that are put on schools and made their responsibility. It's as if schools now have got to solve society, and we can't do that in the time that we've got. And actually, that's not our role. I think a huge challenge is the kind of removal of parents as the first educators of their children, and the kind of setting aside of what it means to be family, and almost this kind of idea of that in schools we're building these little composite citizens that have to go out and do a certain job and perform in a certain way for the economy, etc. Catholic education, I think, offers this beautiful view of the human being, which is rooted in our anthropology, and it's about the young person flourishing and becoming who they're meant to be. And so I think that that's equally challenging as it is. It brings, great moments of just being really delighted in the privilege that you've had to be part of that young person's life.
Just touching a wee bit on that kind of the kind of negative side of things, and teachers being asked to do so much more. Have you found that you've had people who have went into teaching full of enthusiasm, want to be teachers, and then have left and done a different profession because it has been quite stressful?
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think that's just in teaching. I think there's accountants who've done that. I think there's lawyers who've done that. I think there's probably a particular scrutiny on education because it is so public. Everybody thinks that they have knowledge of what it is to be a teacher because they went to school. It's that kind of idea of it. And maybe one of the things is being a pupil in a school. Your experience of being a pupil in a school is not the same as being a teacher. And maybe that kind of fall-off rate of going into teaching is not what I thought it was going to be. Could be, we could look at that in terms of how are we preparing our young people to go into education. I was mentioned that I was in Australia a couple of weeks ago, and there were two young people giving testimony at the conference, and they were people who'd had experience of retreat in their school, and then they'd gone on to be youth ministers in schools, kind of in a lay chaplains group role. And then alongside their teaching degree, they had carried on being peer-to-peer youth ministers while doing their degree. And they were saying, so we were absolutely aware of what it was to be a teacher and the stress points and the anxieties, etc. And we still want to be teachers. So, as I say, I think I think there's also something which we should acknowledge, which is it's quite right and just that if it's not the job for you, don't do it. You know, and I think it's quite brave of people to try it and then say it's that wasn't for me, rather than sticking it out for 20 years and not only them being miserable, but people within their class perhaps not flourishing the way they should.
Yeah. Well, I think anybody who's an educator and their close friend or family circle know how hard they work, not just, during the day, but when they go home at night and stuff like that. There's a lot to take home and things like that. But obviously, it's important for the wider public to support education in general, but why is it important for us to support Catholic education in particular?
So I look at it as Catholic education is one of the ways that we evangelize. It's part of the mission, the mission to go make disciples of all nations. And I think that this is part of our way of doing that. So it's an act of service. It's as I mentioned earlier, it's a good for society to have Catholic education because we offer something which is completely kind of counter to cultural ways of looking at things, So I would say that one of the reasons is that it's an extension of who we are as church. It's an extension of parish, it's an extension of family, but also it's that way of serving the common good.
Do you feel there is potentially a concern, though, that people are using the schools as the church? In the past, it's obviously been the kind of tripod, if you will, of the home, the school and the church. But is there that concern that maybe just the schools getting channeled that, and again that would create a lot of pressure on the school community itself?
Yeah, so I think that that's part of one of the conversations about the synod, isn't it? I don't think it's just in Catholic education that we're seeing that people are actively choosing Catholic education, and I the kind of old tripod thing I think has not been there. It's that, as I say to you, that idea of this kind of rose tinted glasses. You said the school, the family, the church. I think that you meant parish there, because I think that church is all of those
Sure.
things, and I think that part of the conversation of the synod is where is church now, and are we to go where in our situation with education, where the young people are, or are we going to just wait where we are and expect them to come to us? And one of the things which has been reflected on time and time again in Scotland and in England, when we were establishing communities, we built the school first, and we started to educate our young people, and then we built our churches on the parish grounds, and that's because we understood the significance of education linked to what we're doing as our mission. So I think that there's probably I've heard that I've heard people raise the concern, well, Catholic schools, what's the point in them, because kids are all going to school but they're not coming to the parish, and I think there's probably a moment for reflection on that of why. I don't think it's necessarily the school's fault, and I don't think we should be saying, well, the school's not functioning properly. So it's a moment for reflection for the wider church.
And you've touched on it a couple of times during the course of the conversation, but what does the term mission mean to you?
It's funny because that it's one of those ones that recently I've been thinking more and more about schools as a place for evangelisation. and in some instances pre-evangelization, and what mission is. And I say this, and I don't know whether or not it's theologically accurate, but this idea of Jesus gave the disciples a mission: go make disciples of all nations. He didn't give them a church. And the mission has a church, and the mission has schools, and the mission has healthcare, and the mission has adoption societies, and the mission has, international outreach, and, all the work that Missio does. So I think the mission remains the same for all of us. It's to take Christ out into the world. And the mode in which we do that is different for every one of us according to our gifts and talents, our callings, our profession, our family life, etc. So yeah, I think that for me, it goes back to that first missioning of the disciples.
And just to follow on from that, how do you think that we in Scotland and in our schools can be missionaries, and what's the best way we can live out that mission?
Do you know, I think our young people are evangelising the world where they are. They're evangelising their parents. They're changing their communities by demonstrating the things that they're learning about. I see our young people are so keen to ensure that there's justice, that there's tolerance, that they're battling inequity. I think sometimes probably what we need to do is remind them the motivation for that, and that it's Christ that's at the heart of everything that we do. I think for Scotland, we should not lose hope, and we should remind ourselves that we're not doing this on our own, that, the Holy Spirit is the one who's doing the work, and we have to play our part.
And just in terms of, Missio Scotland is obviously the Bishop's chosen charity for the primary schools. Why do you think it's important for people, and indeed kind of Catholic schools, to support the work of Missio Scotland and its partners in the Pontifical Mission Societies?
I think that the Holy Father, Pope Francis, has reminded us about our interconnectedness and about the fact we have a co-responsibility for the world. And when he says that, he doesn't mean the planet. He's not just talking about an eco-conversion. We are responsible for each other as brothers and sisters. It goes right back to Genesis, of being stewards of the world and brothers and sisters with people across the world. And I think that Missio has such a distinctive role in helping our young people to see that their brothers and sisters in the southern world and other parts of the global church are connected to them. And if they're not doing okay, we're not doing okay. So it's that kind of co-responsibility for things. So in a world where everything is about immediacy and everything's about it being quantifiable, what Missio does is it gives our young people value, like real value of what life is, and probably ultimately where they'll find contentment and peace. It's so important that we root our efforts not just in the idea of fundraising, but in learning as well. And I think that that's another aspect that Missio does so well.
Yeah, and just to touch on that, you're someone who provided really good advice to us at Missio Scotland in terms of producing the missionary saints resources, which kind of tie in with Pentecost, confirmation, and things like that. What did you think of that initiative?
So we often have organisations and agencies come to us and say, right, we've got this great idea, and what I think Missio has done really well, they've thought of the child. They've taken the learning and the curriculum, which can be quite heavy, and they've made it child-centred. But they've also thought about the faith journey of the child as well. At that point in their life where they are looking for role models, or looking for people to emulate and be like. So the resources, I think, are a gift to schools. Just pick them up and use them. You don't have to do anything else with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, coming from a background where I've got, teachers, quite close to me and my family and things like that, they're always very keen to say, just make sure you've given the teachers something that they can just take and use straight away, sort of thing. In terms of missionaries, maybe in the traditional sense, do you think it's important to highlight their work in Catholic education as well? We've obviously got some great role models that sometimes, they'll go into the schools and things like that, in primary and secondary, like, Father Pat Hennessy and Father Eugenio Montesi. Do you think it's really important to highlight their lives and their work as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the aspect is that, how will a young person know they want to be a missionary if they've never seen a missionary? How will they know what the work of a missionary is if they've never encountered that within their own life? I think there's probably a really interesting element at the moment about what we mean by missionary. I think there's probably an argument that Scotland's becoming a missionary country as well. We've had so many fruits from having priests and clergy from other continents come even for summer months. And again, I think that what that does is it helps us to connect with our brothers and sisters in the universal church, doesn't it? That all of a sudden it's not just that person that you see in a PowerPoint slide, or the story that you read about how, oh, we must help other people. It's mutually beneficial. And I think that's probably the bit we need to move to, is away from this idea of it's always us here in Scotland or in the Western world helping other people, but the benefits that we get from being such a connected family. So I also think that some of the people that you mentioned, they are just inspirational, aren't they? You couldn't write their life, and when young people hear their stories, it just, I mean, they're saints, they're living saints. I'm probably not allowed to say that, but they feel like they're holy men.
We've had another initiative that's hit the rocks a wee bit because of COVID and things like that, but it was called Get Involved Globally, where we took groups of secondary students with us to see some of the projects in action, see some of the missionaries in action, and hopefully we'll get that back up and running pretty soon. Do you think that that's quite an important initiative as well, because it lets the kids see, not only where their funds go, firsthand, but how missionaries work and have a kind of greater understanding of the universal church too?
Yeah, I think the idea of going on mission, whether it be to another part of your community that needs your help, or to another part of the world where you have helped, is something which is always going to be life-changing for people. I think it's really easy to be caught in your own little world, isn't it? And to just think that this is how things are. To get an experience of what other people are living is so important. And again, I'm going to go back to that point, not because people need us to come in and save them, but because together we're stronger. We're a united force in behalf of what the church is trying to do.
And just to touch on SCES again, what's your kind of hopes for its future, and also the future of Catholic education in a wider sense?
So, in terms of our kind of role, we'll continue working hard on behalf of our schools to ensure that their voices are heard, and I think that'll never get tired, and that'll never get old, because there's always going to be initiatives and strategies where we have to show, if you like, that there's a distinctive way in which our Catholic schools do things, and that's a key part of what we do. We are focusing since 2018 on the idea of leadership legacy as well, and launched the Good Shepherd Leadership Pathway back then, because again, not just in Catholic schools, but across education and indeed worldwide, again, not just in Scotland, there are fewer people who are wanting to take on the responsibility and the role to lead schools and to lead Catholic schools. And so what we're identifying is that we want to start earlier on in someone's career and help them. In terms of hopes for Catholic education in Scotland, I think that the main hope is that we continue to serve Scotland. We continue to have a unique and distinctive approach centred in Christ, which is good for all.
So Barbara, we usually end the interview on a kind of very light-hearted note by asking our interviewees to tell us something about themselves that people might not know.
So I am an award-winning playwright and director.
Wow, can you elaborate a wee bit on that?
It's a very small award, but I said in the beginning that I used to be involved in amateur dramatics, and I had the privilege of, when I lived in Inverclyde, of being involved in a one-act play festival. And sometimes it's hard to find a one-act play that suits the people that you've got for your cast. And so I wrote a play, and it won, and I was directing it. So technically, I am an award-winning playwright and director.
So Barbara, just elaborate a wee tiny bit and tell us about the play.
So it was a short one-act play about the complexity of relationships and the abuse of power in today's society. Fantastic.
So if Take Your Time at SCES comes to an end, it's maybe the West End you're looking at?
I mean, probably. There's probably phone calls right now asking me to write a little something.
Barbara, thanks very much for giving so much of your time, and keep up all the good work.
Thank you.
Missio Scotland is the Scottish branch of the Pontifical Mission Societies, the Pope's official charity for overseas mission. To learn more about the work of Missio Scotland, you can visit our website www.missioscotland.com. You can like us on Facebook, www.facebook.com/Missio Scotland. You can also follow us on Twitter, Missio_Scotland, and on Instagram, Missio Scotland. If you would like to donate to Missio Scotland, visit www.missioscotland.com/donate. You can also call us on 01236 449 774 or send donations to Missio Scotland, 4 Laird Street, Coatbridge, ML5 3LJ. Please keep us in your prayers. Thank you and God bless.